The most dangerous secret is the one people never think to look for. Rain tapped softly against the courthouse windows as the final pages were placed on the table. Outside, downtown Seattle disappeared behind a curtain of gray clouds. But inside courtroom 4B, everything felt painfully clear. Claire Bennett sat quietly at the far end of the polished wooden table, her hands resting on a worn leather purse in her lap. Across from her, Grant Bennett looked like a man who had already moved on. His navy suit was immaculate. His posture was relaxed. The faint smile on his face suggested that the outcome of the morning had never truly been in doubt. One by one, the judge reviewed the final terms of the divorce settlement. The waterfront home would go to Grant. The investment accounts would go to Grant. The luxury vehicles would go to Grant. The majority of the company's shares would go to Grant. Each decision landed with the quiet certainty of a closing door. Around the room, attorneys organized paperwork and exchanged brief nods. No one seemed surprised. After all, Grant Bennett was the successful entrepreneur, the public face of a growing company, the man featured in business magazines and leadership conferences. Claire, at least in the eyes of most people, had simply been his wife. The judge adjusted his glasses and signed the last document. "The court considers the matter resolved," he said. The sound of his pen scratching across paper seemed louder than the rain outside. Grant immediately reached for his copy of the agreement. He glanced over the pages with obvious satisfaction. Claire accepted hers without looking down. For a moment, neither spoke. Then chairs shifted. Attorneys gathered briefcases. The room began moving toward its conclusion. Grant stood first. He buttoned his jacket and looked around as though he had just completed a successful business negotiation. Perhaps, in his mind, he had. "I hope this allows both of us to move forward," he said. His tone was polite enough, but there was something underneath it. Relief. Confidence. Victory. Claire slowly rose from her chair. The difference between them could not have been more obvious. Grant walked away. With properties, accounts, and public admiration, Claire carried a single purse. Yet somehow she appeared calmer than anyone else in the room. An attorney held the door open. Another offered a sympathetic smile. Claire thanked them both and started toward the exit. Behind her, Grant signed one final page. The click of his pen echoed across the room. "You know," he said, stopping her just before she reached the doorway. "Most people would consider this a fresh start." Claire turned. The rain reflected against the courthouse windows behind him, casting pale light across his face. "Maybe it is," she replied. Grant smiled again, the confident smile of a man convinced he had accounted for every detail. "I suppose we both got what we wanted." For the first time that morning, Claire looked directly into his eyes. There was no anger in her expression, no bitterness, only a calm that felt strangely out of place. Then she glanced at the stack of papers resting on the table between them. "One day," she said softly, "you are going to wish you read every page." The smile faded from Grant's face for only a second before returning. He gave a small laugh, dismissing the comment as the final words of a disappointed ex-wife. Claire simply nodded and walked out of the courtroom. Behind her, the door closed with a quiet click. Nobody followed. Nobody stopped her. And nobody noticed that while Grant was celebrating everything he had won, Claire was thinking about something he had never even thought to ask about. The rain had not stopped by the time Claire left the courthouse. Thin streams of water slid down the glass towers of downtown Seattle, turning the city into a collection of blurred lights and reflections. People rushed past with umbrellas and coffee cups, focused on meetings, deadlines, and ordinary concerns. No one noticed the woman walking slowly along the sidewalk, carrying everything she officially owned in a single leather purse. Claire stepped into a small cafe 3 blocks from the courthouse. The warm smell of roasted coffee filled the air. A bell chimed softly above the door as she entered. She ordered a black coffee and chose a seat beside the window. Outside, traffic moved through the rain while inside. Conversations drifted between tables in low, comfortable voices. For the first time all morning, she allowed herself to sit still. The divorce was over. The signatures were complete. The court had spoken. According to every legal document in her purse, Grant Bennett had won. Yet the feeling she expected never arrived. There was no crushing defeat, no panic, no sense that her life had ended. Instead, there was something stranger. Relief. Claire wrapped both hands around the warm coffee cup and stared through the rain-streaked glass. Across the street stood a construction site, where workers moved steel beams beneath the gray sky. The sight pulled her into a memory. 20 years earlier, Grant had stood in a garage no larger than 400 square feet and announced that one day he would build something extraordinary. Back then, nobody believed him. Nobody except Claire. She remembered the old folding table they used as a desk, the second-hand laptop that overheated every afternoon, the nights when they could barely afford groceries. She remembered helping him write business plans until 2 in the morning. She remembered reviewing contracts while balancing a full-time job. She remembered teaching herself accounting software because hiring an accountant was impossible. When investors ignored him, she encouraged him. When clients said no, she helped him prepare for the next meeting. Every success story had a chapter nobody wanted to read because it happened before success looked impressive. Claire had lived inside those chapters for years. A television mounted above the counter suddenly caught her attention. A business news segment appeared on the screen. Grant's face filled the frame. The footage had been recorded weeks earlier. He stood in front of company headquarters discussing leadership and growth. Several customers glanced toward the television and nodded with admiration. One man even commented that Grant Bennett was the perfect example of self-made success. Claire lowered her eyes and smiled faintly into her coffee. Self-made. The phrase followed Grant everywhere now. Nobody mentioned the woman who spent countless nights helping build the foundation beneath the spotlight. Nobody mentioned the opportunities she turned down so he could pursue his ambitions. Nobody mentioned the sacrifices. The world preferred simple stories. They were easier to sell, easier to celebrate, easier to believe. Claire finished her coffee and stepped back into the rain. 20 minutes later, she drove toward the industrial edge of the city where warehouses replaced office towers and narrow roads wound between aging buildings. Eventually, she arrived at a storage facility hidden behind a chain-link fence. The place looked forgettable. That was one reason she chose it years ago. She entered a security code and parked near the far end of the property. Rows of metal storage units stretched into the distance beneath the cloudy sky. Claire walked directly to Unit 314. She stopped in front of the gray metal door and rested her hand on the lock. For several seconds, she simply stood there listening to the rain hitting the roof above. Then she reached into her purse and removed a small key attached to a faded blue tag. The key had been with her through every stage of her marriage. Grant never asked about it. He never noticed it. Slowly, Claire inserted the key into the lock and turned it. The mechanism clicked open with a soft metallic sound. Behind that door waited something Grant had never thought to look for. The metal door rolled upward with a low mechanical rumble, revealing a space that looked surprisingly ordinary. Dust floated through narrow beams of gray afternoon light, filtering in from outside. Shelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling. Filing cabinets stood neatly arranged in rows. Cardboard archive boxes were stacked with careful precision. There were no piles of cash, no hidden gold, no dramatic secrets waiting in plain sight. To anyone else, Unit 314 would have looked like nothing more than a storage room filled with paperwork. Claire stepped inside and slowly closed the door behind her. The sound of rain softened immediately. The world outside disappeared. For a moment, she simply stood there, breathing in the familiar scent of paper, metal, and time. It had been nearly 4 years since her last visit, yet everything remained exactly where she had left it. She walked toward a gray filing cabinet near the back wall and ran her fingertips across the cold metal surface. Every drawer contained pieces of a story that almost nobody knew existed. Years earlier, while Grant traveled across the country meeting investors and appearing on conference stages, Claire had quietly developed a habit. Whenever an important document crossed her desk, she kept a copy. Whenever a legal structure changed, she reviewed it personally. Whenever a new asset was created, she made sure the details were preserved. Not because she expected betrayal. Not because she planned for divorce. At least not in the beginning. She simply believed foundations mattered. Over time, however, she began noticing things. Invitations that no longer included her. Meetings where decisions were made without her knowledge. Conversations that stopped when she entered the room. Small changes. Quiet changes. The kind that seem insignificant until one day they become impossible to ignore. Claire unlocked the top drawer and pulled out a thick folder. Inside were contracts, registrations, ownership records, and correspondence dating back more than a decade. She carefully turned each page. The signatures looked familiar. Some carried the name Claire Bennett. Others carried a different name. Claire Monroe. Her maiden name. The name she continued using on specific legal filings long after her marriage began to change. She paused at one document in particular. The paper had yellowed slightly with age, but the details remained perfectly clear. The filing date. The registration number. The signature. Everything was still valid. Everything was still protected. A faint smile appeared on her face. Outside, thunder rolled somewhere beyond the warehouse district. Claire placed the document back into the folder and continued searching. More files emerged. More records. More proof of work that had quietly disappeared from the public version of history. Most people believed Grant built the company alone. The media certainly believed it. Investors repeated the story constantly. Even employees who joined later accepted it as fact. But these folders told a different version. One where countless decisions happened before anyone cared enough to notice. One where Claire stood beside every important milestone. One where she protected things Grant rarely bothered to read. Her phone vibrated inside her purse. The sound echoed through the storage unit. Claire glanced at the screen. An unknown number. She considered ignoring it. Then curiosity won. Hello. For a second, only silence answered. Then a calm voice spoke. Deep. Controlled. Familiar. I was beginning to wonder if you still used that number. Claire froze. Not because she was afraid. Because she recognized the voice immediately. Years had passed since their last conversation, but some voices remained impossible to forget. She looked down at the folder in her hands. Then toward the rows of documents surrounding her. Nathaniel. A quiet laugh came through the phone. It has been a long time, Claire. Somewhere deep inside the storage unit, among years of forgotten records and carefully guarded secrets, the first piece of the future had just moved into place. For a few seconds after hearing his voice, Claire forgot about the rain outside and the years that had passed. She leaned against the filing cabinet and closed her eyes briefly. Nathaniel Pierce was one of the few people from her past who remembered the beginning. Not the polished version told in interviews. Not the version investors preferred. The real beginning. The garage. The uncertainty. The endless work that happened before success became visible. I did not expect to hear from you, Claire said. A soft chuckle came through the phone. That makes two of us. I was not sure you would answer. Claire glanced around the storage unit. Shelves filled with records surrounded her like silent witnesses. How did you know where to find me? I did not, Nathaniel replied. I only knew you would eventually return to the things that mattered. The answer sounded exactly like him. Years ago, before he became one of the most influential investors in the country, Nathaniel had been an ambitious entrepreneur struggling to secure funding for an idea nobody believed in. Most people dismissed him after a 15-minute meeting. Claire had stayed for 2 hours. She listened. She asked questions. She treated him with respect when there was no obvious benefit in doing so. Neither of them had forgotten that conversation. I heard about the divorce, Nathaniel said carefully. Claire smiled faintly. News traveled quickly in business circles. Then you probably heard that Grant did very well. That depends on how you define well. The answer caught her attention. Nathaniel was not the type of person who spoke carelessly. Every word usually served a purpose. Claire straightened slightly. What does that mean? There was a brief silence. In the background, she could hear distant city noise and the faint sound of traffic. Then Nathaniel spoke. It means I have spent the last 6 months reviewing a transaction that involves Grant's company. Claire's expression remained calm, but her focus sharpened instantly. A transaction? A very large one. She listened without interrupting. The acquisition has attracted attention from several investment groups. Mine included. Claire looked down at the folder still resting in her hand. Something about the conversation felt deliberate, as if Nathaniel had called for a reason beyond simple curiosity. And, she asked, and during the review process, I found something interesting. The storage unit suddenly felt smaller. The rain continued tapping against the metal roof above. What kind of something? Nathaniel paused. The kind that made me wonder whether Grant understands everything he believes he owns. Claire said nothing. Her silence seemed to confirm something for him. That is what I thought, he said. She slowly walked between the rows of cabinets until she reached a small wooden desk near the back wall. A faded photograph rested there. It showed 3 people standing in front of an old warehouse years earlier. Claire, Grant, Nathaniel. Nobody looked wealthy. Nobody looked important. Yet every future decision seemed hidden somewhere inside that photograph. "There is more, isn't there?" she asked quietly. "Yes." Nathaniel's voice remained calm. "I think it is time we meet." Claire stared at the photograph for another moment before placing it face down on the desk. Outside, thunder rolled across the Seattle skyline. Inside the storage unit, years of forgotten history sat waiting in carefully organized boxes. "Where?" she asked. Nathaniel answered immediately, as though he had expected her response. "Tomorrow, 2 o'clock. The harbor room overlooking Elliott Bay." Claire glanced toward the locked cabinets surrounding her. Then she looked at the documents in her hands. The past had been quiet for a very long time. Suddenly, it seemed ready to speak. "I will be there," she said. When the call ended, she remained standing in silence. Somewhere across the city, Grant was probably celebrating his future. He had no idea that the first challenge to that future had already begun. The next afternoon, a pale spring sun broke through the clouds hanging over Elliott Bay, casting silver reflections across the water. Claire arrived at the harbor room 10 minutes early. The restaurant occupied the upper floor of a historic waterfront building, offering panoramic views of ferries crossing the bay and distant mountains rising beyond the city. It was the kind of place where powerful people discussed deals worth millions of dollars over quiet lunches and carefully measured conversations. Claire chose a table near the window. The water moved gently below while sailboats drifted through the harbor. For a moment, the scene felt disconnected from everything that had happened during the past week. Then the elevator doors opened. Nathaniel Pierce stepped into the dining room. Several people recognized him immediately. A few glanced up from their meals. Others whispered quietly. Nathaniel ignored the attention completely. He wore a charcoal suit without a tie, and his expression carried the same calm confidence Claire remembered from years ago. He reached the table and smiled. "Claire." "Nathaniel." They shook hands and sat down. For the first few minutes, they spoke about ordinary things. Travel, the economy, mutual acquaintances. Neither seemed interested in rushing toward the real reason for the meeting. Lunch arrived. The conversation remained comfortable, familiar. Yet, beneath it, Claire could sense the weight of something waiting to be discussed. Finally, Nathaniel placed his coffee cup down and folded his hands together. Grant's acquisition is larger than most people realize. Claire was not surprised. Business news had been filled with rumors for months. Analysts called it transformational. Investors described it as career-defining. Grant himself had probably already imagined the headlines. "How large?" she asked. Nathaniel glanced briefly toward the harbor before answering. "Large enough to attract international investors. Large enough to change the future of his company." Claire nodded slowly. "Then why are you concerned?" Nathaniel reached into a leather portfolio resting beside his chair and removed a thin folder. He slid it across the table. Claire opened it carefully. Inside were summaries of due diligence reports, ownership structures, acquisition schedules, and legal reviews. She read silently for several moments. Then her eyes stopped on a familiar phrase. Intellectual property assets. She continued reading. The farther she went, the quieter she became. Nathaniel watched without interrupting. Finally, Claire looked up. "You found it." Nathaniel nodded once. Not immediately. Most people never would have. Claire turned several more pages. There it was. A chain of filings stretching back years. Registrations connected to assets that had become increasingly valuable over time. Assets critical to the acquisition. Assets linked not to Grant Bennett, not to his company, but to Claire Monroe. Her maiden name. The name attached to documents stored safely inside Unit 314. For a long moment, neither spoke. The sounds of the restaurant faded into the background. The water outside shimmered beneath the afternoon light. Claire slowly closed the folder. Grant never checked. Nathaniel gave a faint smile. Grant checked what interested him. The answer was painfully accurate. Throughout their marriage, Grant focused on growth, expansion, visibility, and valuation. Claire focused on protection, documentation, structure, long-term stability. Their partnership worked because each compensated for the other's blind spots. Until, eventually, he stopped believing he had any blind spots at all. Nathaniel leaned slightly forward. "There is something else." Claire met his gaze. "What?" "The acquisition gala is scheduled in 3 weeks." She already knew about the event. Every major publication in Seattle seemed to be talking about it. And Nathaniel's expression remained calm. "You received an invitation this morning." Claire blinked. She had not checked her mail before leaving home. Nathaniel smiled faintly at her surprise. Grant wants you there. Claire looked out toward the bay. Somewhere across the city, an invitation was waiting on her kitchen counter. Grant believed he was inviting her to witness the greatest victory of his life. Neither man across from her needed to explain the irony. Slowly, Claire rested her hand on the folder and smiled for the first time that afternoon. Then I suppose I should attend. The invitation arrived exactly where Nathaniel said it would. Claire found it waiting on her kitchen counter when she returned home that evening, resting among a stack of unopened mail. The envelope was thick, cream-colored, and embossed with elegant gold lettering. Even before opening it, she knew who had sent it. She carried it to the window overlooking the street below and carefully unfolded the card inside. The acquisition gala would take place in 3 weeks at the Grand Crescent Hotel, one of the most exclusive venues in Seattle. Business leaders, investors, journalists, and executives from across the country would attend. At the bottom of the invitation, beneath the formal details, a handwritten note appeared in familiar handwriting. Looking forward to celebrating this milestone. Hope to see you there. Grant. Claire stared at the words for several seconds before placing the invitation on the table. Outside, evening lights began appearing across the city. Cars moved through rain-darkened streets while office towers glowed against the fading sky. Somewhere downtown, Grant was probably finalizing presentations, speaking with investors, and preparing for the biggest moment of his professional life. The thought did not make Claire angry. If anything, it made her thoughtful. For years, she had watched Grant chase larger opportunities, larger audiences, and larger victories. Every achievement pushed him forward. Every success convinced him he was unstoppable. Yet somewhere along the way, he stopped paying attention to the details that protected everything he built. Over the following days, Claire settled into a quiet routine. Mornings began with coffee and document reviews. Afternoons were spent organizing records from Unit 314. Evenings often included phone calls with Nathaniel and legal advisors. Every meeting revealed another layer of information, another piece of the puzzle, another reminder that preparation often mattered more than visibility. Meanwhile, news about the acquisition continued spreading. Business publications praised Grant's leadership. Financial analysts predicted tremendous growth. Interviews appeared online almost daily. In every photograph, Grant looked confident, victorious, certain of the future waiting for him. One Saturday morning, Claire visited a small boutique several neighborhoods away from downtown. The shop specialized in timeless designs rather than luxury labels. She spent nearly an hour browsing before selecting a simple white evening gown. It was elegant without being extravagant, graceful without demanding attention, the kind of dress that reflected confidence rather than wealth. The owner offered several more expensive options, but Claire declined politely. She was not interested in impressing anyone. She simply wanted to arrive as herself. That evening, Nathaniel called. "How are preparations going?" he asked. Claire smiled as she looked at the garment bag hanging near her bedroom door. "Surprisingly well." "Nervous?" Nathaniel's question lingered for a moment. Claire considered it carefully. 3 weeks earlier, she might have answered differently. 3 weeks earlier, she had walked out of a courthouse carrying what appeared to be the remains of a broken future. Now everything felt different. Not because circumstances had changed overnight, because she had remembered who she was before fear entered the picture. "No," she said honestly. "I am not nervous." Nathaniel seemed pleased by the answer. "Good." After ending the call, Claire stepped onto her small balcony. The air smelled faintly of rain and salt carried inland from the bay. Below, city lights stretched toward the horizon. She rested her hands on the railing and looked out across Seattle. Somewhere beyond those lights stood the hotel where Grant planned to celebrate his greatest triumph. He believed the evening would mark the beginning of a new chapter. Claire smiled softly into the night. In that, at least, he was absolutely right. 3 weeks passed quickly. On the evening of the gala, downtown Seattle shimmered beneath a sky streaked with fading shades of blue and gold. Luxury cars lined the entrance of the Grand Crescent Hotel, while photographers, journalists, and guests moved beneath towering glass archways illuminated by warm light. Inside, the ballroom looked like a celebration of success itself. Crystal chandeliers hung from vaulted ceilings. Golden reflections danced across polished marble floors. Conversations floated through the room in soft waves as executives, investors, and business leaders gathered for what many were already calling the most important corporate event of the year. At the center of the attention stood Grant Bennett. Dressed in a perfectly tailored tuxedo, he moved comfortably through the crowd, shaking hands, accepting congratulations, and posing for photographs. Confidence seemed to follow him wherever he went. Every smile suggested certainty. Every conversation reinforced the same narrative. He had built something remarkable. He had secured a transformational acquisition. He was about to enter the most successful chapter of his career. Beside him stood Vanessa Cole, the woman who had become a familiar presence in recent months. Elegant and polished, she listened as guests praised Grant's accomplishments. Together, they looked exactly like the image many people expected to see on the cover of a business magazine. Across the ballroom, enormous screens displayed company logos, growth statistics, and carefully designed visuals celebrating the future. Everything appeared flawless. Everything appeared inevitable. Then the ballroom doors opened. The change was subtle at first. A few heads turned. Conversations paused for a second longer than usual. Then the reaction spread through the room. Claire Bennett stepped inside. She wore the simple white gown she had chosen weeks earlier. No extravagant jewelry. No attempt to compete with anyone else's display of wealth. Yet somehow she drew more attention than many of the guests who had spent fortunes trying to be noticed. There was something different about her presence. Calm, composed, unshaken. She moved through the ballroom with quiet confidence, acknowledging familiar faces with polite smiles. Several people seemed surprised to see her. Others appeared curious. After the divorce, most assumed Claire had disappeared from the story completely. Yet here she was, walking into the very room where Grant expected to celebrate his greatest victory. Grant spotted her from across the ballroom almost immediately. For a brief moment, genuine surprise crossed his face. Then he recovered and smiled. Excusing himself from a group of investors, he walked toward her. Claire. His voice carried warmth, though there was also something else beneath it. Satisfaction. I am glad you came. Claire returned a polite smile. Thank you for inviting me. Grant glanced around the ballroom. Quite a night. Claire followed his gaze. Crystal light reflected across hundreds of glasses and polished surfaces. It certainly is. Several nearby guests drifted closer without appearing obvious about it. Grant seemed to enjoy the attention. You know, he said, there were moments years ago when I wondered if any of this would ever happen. Claire nodded. I remember. The answer seemed to catch him slightly off guard. Perhaps because she sounded sincere. She did remember. Every difficult step. Every uncertain year. Every sacrifice. Grant smiled again. Well, I guess it worked out. Claire studied him quietly for a moment. Then she looked toward the stage where final preparations were underway. The night is not over yet. Grant laughed softly. To him, the comment sounded harmless. To Claire, it sounded like a simple statement of fact. Somewhere near the entrance, another guest had just arrived. Most people had not noticed yet. But Nathaniel Pierce had stepped into the ballroom, and the course of the evening was about to change. Nathaniel Pierce did not announce his arrival. He did not need to. Within minutes, word had quietly spread through the ballroom. Conversations shifted. Investors who had been focused entirely on Grant's acquisition began glancing toward the entrance. Journalists adjusted their attention. Even experienced executives seemed curious. Nathaniel rarely attended public celebrations unless he had a reason. Grant noticed the change immediately. From across the room, he watched as Nathaniel greeted several guests before making his way toward the center of the ballroom. His expression remained confident, but a small crease appeared between his eyebrows. It disappeared almost as quickly as it arrived. Nathaniel eventually reached Claire. The two exchanged a brief handshake and a polite smile. Nothing dramatic, nothing unusual. Yet somehow that simple interaction generated more interest than any speech delivered that evening. People noticed. They always noticed when influential individuals treated someone with visible respect. Grant approached moments later. Nathaniel, he said warmly, extending his hand. I appreciate you coming. Nathaniel shook it. Congratulations on the acquisition. The response sounded professional. Neutral. Grant relaxed slightly. Around them, guests began moving toward their seats as the evening presentation was about to begin. Crystal chandeliers glowed overhead while enormous screens illuminated the stage. Soon the ballroom settled into attentive silence. Grant stepped onto the platform to enthusiastic applause. He looked exactly where he believed he belonged, at the center of attention, at the height of success. His presentation unfolded smoothly. Charts appeared on giant screens. Revenue projections, growth forecasts, market opportunities. The audience responded positively. Several investors nodded approvingly. Journalists typed notes. Cameras flashed. Everything was proceeding exactly according to plan. Claire sat quietly near the front beside Nathaniel. She listened without expression. Every statistic, every projection, every confident statement. Then Grant arrived at the final section of his presentation. The acquisition itself. His voice carried excitement now. This transaction positions our company for unprecedented expansion over the next decade. Applause filled the room. Grant smiled broadly. Tonight marks the beginning of a new era. More applause followed. Then one of the attorneys overseeing the transaction stepped onto the side of the stage. The interruption seemed routine at first. Legal formalities often accompanied acquisitions of this size. The attorney adjusted his glasses and approached the microphone. Before final recognition of the transaction, there is one matter requiring clarification. The room gradually became quiet. Grant looked mildly confused but remained composed. The attorney continued. During the final stages of due diligence, questions arose regarding ownership of several intellectual property assets contributing significantly to the valuation of this acquisition. A few investors exchanged puzzled glances. Grant's smile faded slightly. Behind him, the presentation screens changed. Revenue charts disappeared. New documents appeared instead. Legal filings, registration records, ownership structures. The ballroom grew noticeably still. Grant turned toward the screens. For the first time all evening, uncertainty crossed his face. The attorney continued reading. The review determined that certain foundational intellectual property assets are not owned by Grant Bennett or his company. Murmurs spread across the audience. Journalists immediately leaned forward. Investors sat straighter. The attorney pointed toward the screens displaying a series of registrations dating back years. Each filing contained the same name, Claire Monroe. The maiden name Claire had quietly maintained on critical legal documents. Complete silence followed. Grant stared at the records as if seeing them for the first time. Because he was. Every filing was legitimate. Every registration valid. Every signature authentic. The assets supporting a significant portion of the acquisition's value had never belonged to him. They belonged to the woman sitting calmly in the front row. Claire did not smile. She did not celebrate. She simply met Grant's gaze across the ballroom. Around them, hundreds of people watched the truth emerge one document at a time. And for the first time that evening, Grant Bennett looked like a man who realized he might not have understood his own story at all. The silence inside the ballroom lasted only a few moments, but it felt much longer. Investors reviewed the documents displayed on the screens. Attorneys quietly exchanged comments. Journalists typed furiously as the story changed in real time before their eyes. The acquisition had not collapsed. The company had not vanished. But the narrative everyone believed had suddenly fractured. The foundation beneath it was no longer as simple as it appeared. Grant remained standing on the stage. The confidence that had carried him through the evening had faded into something more complicated. He looked toward the screens, then toward Claire, then back at the documents again. It was the expression of a man realizing that the details he once considered unimportant had become impossible to ignore. Claire remained seated for another moment before slowly standing. She did not make a speech. She did not ask for attention. She simply rose with the same quiet composure she had carried from the courthouse weeks earlier. Around her, conversations resumed in cautious whispers. Nathaniel remained nearby, saying nothing. He understood that this moment did not belong to him. It belonged to the woman who had spent years protecting pieces of a story that nobody bothered to read. Eventually, Claire turned and walked toward the ballroom exit. The crowd parted naturally as she moved through it. Some people offered respectful nods. Others simply watched. No one seemed quite sure what to say. Outside the ballroom, the hotel corridor felt almost peaceful compared to the noise behind her. Warm light reflected against polished stone floors. Large windows overlooked the Seattle skyline, where thousands of lights stretched across the darkness. Claire stopped near one of the windows and looked out at the city. For the first time all evening, she allowed herself a slow breath. A few minutes later, heard footsteps approaching from behind. She already knew who it was. Claire. Grant's voice sounded different now. Not defeated. Not angry. Just quieter than before. She turned to face him. For several seconds neither spoke. The city lights reflected in the glass beside them. Somewhere behind the ballroom doors, investors and attorneys continued discussing the future. But out here, the conversation felt strangely simple. Grant looked at her carefully. You knew all along. Claire considered the statement before answering. I knew what I had protected. Grant lowered his eyes briefly. Why did you never tell me? The question hung between them. Claire almost smiled. Not because the answer was amusing, but because it was obvious. Because you stopped asking. The words landed softly. No accusation. No bitterness. Just truth. Grant leaned back slightly, as though the realization weighed more than any financial report he had reviewed that year. He remembered the long nights in the garage, the contracts he never read, the meetings he rushed through, the details he assumed would always take care of themselves. More than anything, he remembered how often Claire had been there, quietly handling problems before they became crises, quietly building structures strong enough to survive even when nobody noticed them. I thought I understood everything, he admitted. Claire nodded gently. I know. For a moment neither moved. Then Grant looked toward the ballroom. What happens now? Claire followed his gaze toward the closed doors. Investors, lawyers, executives, reporters, all trying to predict the future. She smiled softly. Now the truth becomes part of the story. Grant gave a slow nod. There was nothing left to argue about. Nothing left to win. Their marriage had ended long before the paperwork was signed. What remained now was understanding. Claire turned toward the hotel entrance. Nathaniel waited nearby, giving them space. Beyond the glass doors, Seattle shimmered beneath the night sky.